All right, so I think we will kick things off as it is now 1 after, and we'll see if some more people join us afterwards. But so once again, my name is Rob Luzinski, and I'm with the Stewardship Network. And I just wanted to thank you all for being a part of our Wetland Protection Workshop series. We are doing this in partnership with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. And we're really excited to have you here. We have a couple more sessions that are a part of this series, and I will share the website in the chat for that, but it's stewardshipnetwork.org/EGLE, EGLE. And with that, I would like to pass it off to Jacqueline Courteau, who will be doing our workshop, Wetlands for Landowners, Recognizing, Understanding, and Caring for Wetlands on Your Land. Take it away, Jacqueline.
Thank you so much, Rob. And thank you to the Stewardship Network and to EGLE for doing this whole big series of workshops. And I just want to encourage everybody. I feel like I'm coming at the end with the intro workshop, but there are a lot of really rich workshops in the previous part of the series that go into a lot of more detail about some of the things that I'm going to preview here, an overview. And so if I say something, for instance, about wetland protection, I'm going to be very brief, and I would encourage you to track down some of the other workshops that have already happened and find more detail there. So I'm really focused on giving a broad overview. So let's talk about recognizing, understanding, and caring for wetlands on your land. First of all, if you do have a wetland on your property, congratulations. It is such a wonderful resource to have. You might have many wonderful plants to see. You will likely have some interesting herpetofauna, that is, frogs and toads, salamanders, lizards, turtles. And your wetland provides services and beauty not only for you, but for many of your neighbors and for the state as a whole. So wonderful to have a wetland. Now, what do you do with it? Oops. So the first thing you want to do with it is learn about it. And if you don't learn anything else from this workshop, I hope that you learn how to recognize poison sumac. You might want to just get rid of poison sumac because, like poison ivy, it can cause a rash, but it actually, those fruits that are dangling in the middle of the slide are actually wonderful food for birds, and especially migratory birds. The fall color shown on the right is really lovely, and it's really highlighting sumac right now if you go out in the wetlands. If you have a shrubby wetland that has some really muddy, mucky soil, maybe some peat, and you're kind of wading through it and trying to get through, and you reach out to catch your balance, you're probably going to be grabbing onto poison sumac. So you want to be careful of it, but all you have to do is carry along a bottle of rubbing alcohol and just wash yourself off with alcohol. If you want to take a sip of alcohol, don't use the rubbing alcohol. Some people do think, whenever I mention rubbing alcohol, people wonder whether they should drink it. No, do not drink rubbing alcohol, but just wash your hands or wherever you touched it. Soap and water also works well. And just remember that the oils can get on your clothing. So wash your clothes, otherwise you can get reinfected. So if you learn nothing else from this workshop, I hope you remember poison sumac. But that's really the main thing you have to worry about, other than getting your feet muddy and your clothes muddy. So let's move on and think about wetlands. I just want to spend this time to think about how we define wetlands, to consider some kinds of wetlands that are out there and how you recognize them, to review why wetlands are so important, and then to just talk a little bit about how to protect and manage your wetlands. There are some legal statutes that protect wetlands, and so you do have some responsibilities as a landowner to know what those statutes are. But also there's some possible income options if you really want to participate in wetland protection. And I'm only going to mention stewardship of wetlands briefly, but again, encourage you to look to the Stewardship Network and other organizations in your area to think about how really to steward your wetlands. So what is a wetland? Well, obviously a wetland, an area where the land and water meet. And there are some statutory definitions, both in Michigan law and in federal law, and the Michigan law is very similar to the federal definition, Michigan law defines a wetland as a land characterized by the presence of water at a frequency and duration sufficient to support, and that under normal circumstances does support, wetland vegetation or aquatic life, and is commonly referred to as a bog, swamp, or marsh. We'll go into all of those terms in more detail. But so the keys in that definition of the key wetland characteristics are water, that is the hydrology, the soil, and the plants, and whether those plants are adapted to wetland conditions. So thinking about that a little bit more, a wetland is not necessarily always wet, but it is wet for some part of the year. And that's not always standing water, as we'll see. Soils, the soils that develop and characterize wetlands are either hydric soils, that is, they show the marks that develop with standing water, such as iron or calcium deposits or very heavy clay. Or they might be organic soils, organic matter, or peat, which is compressed, partly decomposed organic matter. And finally, the plants that grow in wetland are referred to as hydrophytes, and they are physiologically adapted to having standing water during part of the growing season. And they can tolerate changing conditions because many wetlands vary from very wet to occasionally dry or dry for long periods of time. So again, let's take these each in detail. Thinking about wetland hydrology, obviously we want to think about the water sources. So in Michigan, many of our wetlands are on the coastal areas. The Great Lakes in the past had vast areas of marshes adjacent to the shore that were wetlands. If we were on the east or west coast, the ocean would be our coastal areas. Many wetlands do occur along smaller water bodies, such as on the edges of lakes, ponds, rivers, or streams. Low places in the landscape where water drains into and pools, especially if the soil is such that it holds the water in that place. And so areas with a high water table. Now, sometimes a high water table can occur even on the top of a slope, again, depending on what the groundwater hydrology is like and what your soils are like. Another place where wetlands occur is on groundwater seeps, and those are often on hillsides or have a gentle slope. And we'll talk a little bit more later about plants such as skunk cabbage that can occur on those slopes and indicate that there's a seep there. Wetlands can also occur on areas that seem fairly flat, but they have an impervious clay layer. So especially toward Detroit and the southeast part of state in the old glacial lake plain, there are many areas called flatwoods that are flat but hold water because of that impervious clay layer. And then finally, we've created some wetlands through ditches or channels that have been dug and then abandoned, and sometimes even old quarries that have partly filled in and have been left, or the edges of old quarries. So those are some likely water sources for wetlands. As a starting point, you might look at your county's map of rivers, streams, and drains, so-called drains. We'll get back to that term later. But keep in mind that this map shows the above ground water flows. There are also groundwater flows, which are not visible on the map. So how wet is a wetland? If you step into water that has been there for 3 or more weeks during the growing season, as on the left picture where I stepped into a wetland patch, that's probably a wetland. And you can see wetland adapted plants, those little bitty floating specks of green are actually duckweed. Even though duckweed all looks the same, there are at least 8 or 10 different species of duckweed, and I'm pretty sure that one is called Lemna minor. But if there are there's standing water and very obviously wetland plants like a duckweed that only floats on the surface of water. And by the way, cool thing about duckweed is it's the smallest flowering plant. That's likely a wetland. But what if on the right, you step onto a muddy patch? That could be after a rain, but how do you know whether that muddy patch might be part of a wetland? Again, the key is it wet enough to develop wetland plants? So if you are a farmer and you have crops in the field, you probably know that standing water can drown crop plants within 3 days. And typically we find that any area with standing water more than 2 to 3 weeks of the year, or of the growing season, or saturated soil, and 2 to 3 weeks may even be on the high side, because many plants respire right at the base. Woody plants do. They have a respiration zone in their root collar, so they really need to have some air. And if the water is flowing over that root collar for very long, they're starved of oxygen. And similarly, other plants rely on oxygen in the root pores and root spaces. And so standing water is a problem for plants that are not adapted to those conditions. So standing water or saturated soil during some part of the growing season is key. However, keep in mind that wetlands are very dynamic, and really, truly, the only constant is change. Water levels can change from season to season. A very common pattern is to have an area that is wet in the spring but dries out in the summer. But in coastal areas, obviously, you can have wet to dry during a tidal cycle. Or you can have year-to-year effects. Those of you who live near the Great Lakes know that Great Lakes levels vary over time. And even in smaller wetlands inland, you can have cumulative effects over the course of the year. So wet some years and dry in others. And that can be changing with climate change as well. The Little Buttonbush Swamp in my backwoods had many years where it was quite dry every summer. And then the past 3 years with our very wet springs, it had standing water for 2 full years in a row. And that can change the species mix. But then this year with a long dry spell in the middle of the summer, it dried out again. So constant change of whether it's wet or dry and for how long. And then keep in mind that just in ecological terms, over decades to centuries to millennia, many wetlands fill in over time and convert to more upland types of systems. So sediment enters the wetland, plants grow there and build up the organic matter. And many areas will evolve, for instance, from an open pond to a marsh or maybe a bog, and then ultimately that can be filled in as well. And certain plants in particular, such as cattails, are very good at pulling a lot of water from a wetland and potentially drying it out. So when cattails go to town because of high nutrients, that can actually change your wetland over time to a different kind of system. So I want to talk just briefly about wetland soils, which I'll term mineral soils and muck. And by muck, I really mean organic matter or peat. And I'm only going to talk about these briefly. Soil science is a full semester class, and identifying wetland soils requires professional training and certification using the manual that I've shown there on the right. However, I'm just going to talk about some of the most basic things to look for. So mineral soil is soil that was derived from bedrock, and throughout much of Michigan, that soil was deposited or shaped by glaciers and flowing water, or a combination of the two. When water stands on that soil, it leads to some telltale soil characteristics that you can delve into farther in the manual that I've shown. The other type of soil in wetlands is not really soil at all. It's peat or organic matter. When organic matter decomposes, you'll get that black mucky stuff that's very slippery, and that can compress into peat, that partially decomposed layers, and peat can be many feet deep. Those of you who might have Northern European connections know that that peat is often mined and used as a source of heat. So the turf or the peat is burned. Peat is often also mined and used in gardening. And again, that layer of peat can be just a thin layer on top, or it can be many meters deep. Peat is sometimes considered a renewable resource, but given that it takes thousands of years to replace several meters deep of peat that is mined, it's not truly a renewable resource in our lifetimes. And so I think peat mining should be done with caution. But thinking back to your own wetlands and soil, so I've talked about mineral soils, and many of you probably know a lot about soils if you're gardeners, but if you aren't as familiar, you've probably heard terms like loam and clay loam or sandy loam. And I just wanted to show you this chart, which explains the different soil sizes. So those terms, sand, silt, and clay, depend on the particle size. Sand is the largest, clay is the smallest, and silt is intermediate. And loam is just a mix of different particle sizes. So wetland soils tend to be those with the smaller particle sizes on the clay to silty clay loam to the clay to silt axis here. So when you have a high proportion of clay particles or quite a lot of silt as well as clay, those are soils where wetlands are very likely to develop, because those smaller particle sizes have smaller pores between them and the water doesn't escape as readily. Now, wetlands can occur in sandier soils if those have, for instance, a groundwater source or a seep. So if there's groundwater close to the surface bubbling into that sandy area, or again, often in coastal areas that are very sandy soils, but constantly have water replenishing. So it's not only the clay soils that get wetlands, but those typically will be wetland soils. And just as a way to look at that farther, again, you can look at a soil map for your county that shows the hydrologic soil types. I wish they would do a better coloration on this map, because I find it a little bit tricky to tell the differences. But this lightest color here, the clays in this area, sort of in the eastern part of the county, and then down here. And then you have the sandy clay loam or the silt loam, some of the colors down here. So that's where you might expect that you could find some wetlands. Again, you can find wetlands in sandy soils if there's a water source near, so that's not the only place. But I'd encourage you, if you have an interest in soils in your area, to go to the Web Soil Survey or else to your county and find the soil map or this hydrologic soil map. And then there are many levels of detail that you can get into around soils to find out more about your soils. So let's think for a minute about wetland plants. So we've talked about hydrology, we've talked about soils, and then the third indicator of wetlands is that you have plants adapted to wetlands. Well, what are those adaptations? As I mentioned, standing water during the growing season is a real challenge for plants. And some of the challenges that poses is those fluctuating water levels, like wet to dry, can be changing a lot. But when that water is standing there, there's limited oxygen, there's limited carbon dioxide, which plants also need. And if the water is deep enough, there might be limited light levels. Finally, there's often a difficulty obtaining nutrients because nutrients might flow away or might be available in different form in the more aquatic environment. So given all of those challenges, plants that grow in wetlands have evolved a series of structural or physiological adaptations to cope with those conditions. And botanists and ecologists over the years have rated plants by their adaptability to wetlands. And so you'll often hear plants categorized in terms of whether they are obligate wetland plants, that is, plants that require wetlands in order to survive, or whether they are facultative plants, that is, plants that tolerate wetland conditions and are found there a large percentage of the time. So we call them facultative wetland plants. If they're 66 to 97% of the time they grow in a wetland, or if they grow in a wetland a third to 2/3 of the time, you would just call it a facultative plant. Those terms are relevant when you're delineating a wetland, that is, when people go out and map wetlands and look at the boundaries, which is done for any kind of regulatory oversight. So that's an important process if wetlands are regulated. And if you as a landowner have a wetland and are thinking of any kind of construction activity, digging, dredging, even just building a boardwalk so you can enjoy it, you need to meet those regulatory requirements, and you should probably have someone map your wetlands. But let's just take a quick look at some of those wetland adaptations. So starting on the top photo of this little bladderwort, and then on the right, this pitcher plant. Both of those are actually carnivorous plants, and carnivory is in which they capture and absorb insects to supplement their nutrients. So carnivory has evolved as a response to the low nutrient conditions of some of these wet systems. On the lower right, you have floating leaves. Many aquatic plants, particularly we would call them emergent or submergent plants, have leaves that float on the surface that allows them to still get plenty of light even though there's water there. And in the middle too, I've shown a floating leaf. On the lower left, plants that grow in trees that grow in wet forested conditions, where there might be a clay layer, often have what's called a buttress trunk. That is, that spreads the trunk wide at the base to try to hold on. Often the roots are very shallow, and you might have spreading roots to help hold on to the surface in those shallow conditions where there might be a very hard layer of clay that prevents deep rooting. And finally, we don't have them here in Michigan yet anyway. I mean, who knows what might happen with climate change, but farther south in the US, bald cypress trees have this wild adaptation called a pneumatophore, those bald cypress knees that are shown here and that are found in places like Arkansas and Mississippi and Louisiana. Those are actually adaptations for breathing. So those allow for gas exchange and allow that tree to get some air and some oxygen even in very wet conditions. So who knows whether those will migrate north with climate change, but it's such an interesting adaptation, just had to show it. So let's move on to why wetlands are important. I've included a little sketch here that kind of summarizes some of the things that wetlands do. And some of those are considered ecosystem services. That is, when we think from a human perspective about what do wetlands do for us, how do their functions offer values to people. But others of those are for natural communities. There are some diverse and special plants, as I suggested, that reside in wetlands, and wetlands provide vital wildlife habitat for a range of species, including both those herpetofauna or herps that I referred to, frogs, toads, salamanders, as well as numerous birds and also some fur-bearing mammals. So one of the key wetland services is to slow erosion and buffer flooding. And you can see in an area like this, that there's lots of places where water can come in and be stored in this system and then gradually absorbed or gradually drained back out again at a slow rate so that sediment can settle. And here too, this is a more urban created wetland where stormwater is filtered into this system, or sorry, piped into this system. It sits here, sediment and pollutants can settle out, and then the water can be absorbed slowly back to recharge groundwater. So that water filtering capacity and sedimentation settling capacity is really important for water quality, and particularly in our urban areas, but also in our coastal areas or any area connected to flowing water. Related to that, because of the many wildlife that live in or near wetlands, including fish, birds, and many mammals, wetlands are often very important areas for recreational pursuits such as hunting and fishing. The services that wetland provides for people are related to those functions, but there are many different ways of trying to attach a socioeconomic or dollar figure to those wetlands, and the values, monetary values, range widely. I didn't try to come up with estimates for Michigan for this presentation, but in the past I've seen estimate it's in the many millions of dollars for those services. Let's think about wetlands for wildlife. So wetlands, as I mentioned, provide essential breeding ground for many species of herps, particularly frogs and salamanders. Half of all bird species in Michigan breed in or use wetlands at some point of their life, often as a migratory stopover. I've talked about, and I will show, some of the diverse and unique wildflower species that live in wetlands. And I just want to make the point that many wetland species are rare due to their specialized environmental requirements. And so they're particularly vulnerable to habitat loss. As I mentioned, herps need wetlands. So most of Michigan's 18 species of turtles, 18 species of snakes, 11 species of turtles, 2 species of lizards, and 14 species of frogs and toads, as well as 14 species of salamanders, need wetlands for part of their life cycle. Many frogs and toads rely entirely on wetlands for their breeding. And because they are present in so much water and spend so much time in the water, they particularly need high quality water. So pollution can be a real problem for these species. And wetlands both serve as habitat, but also serve as water filters to ensure water quality. So I'd encourage you to look further on the previous talks about wetlands and herps to get some more ideas about how important wetlands are and how to best manage wetlands for herp habitat. Just want to make a quick note while we're talking about herps. If you have a wetland, just do beware that the eastern Massasauga rattlesnake, which is now a federally threatened species and is very much protected by regulation, that could occur on your wetland. It is Michigan's only native poisonous snake, but keep in mind that they are fairly shy snakes. They're quite small, and generally you are much more of a threat to the snake than it is to you. So good idea to tread carefully, maybe wear boots when you're in your wetland, and keep on the lookout, but they are small snakes, maybe a foot or so long at the most. And if you hear that rattle, just skirt it a little bit and stay away. But humans have been much more of a threat overall to the rattlesnake. And in particular, this rattlesnake, because it's so small, is only, the bite is venomous, but would mostly be a threat to small children or very small children. And just to think more about the Massasauga, we are lucky to be the center of its range. And in fact, most of its habitat lies in Michigan. So although many people are nervous about snakes, it's actually a really wonderful resource that we have to be the center of its habitat. As I mentioned, an estimated 50% of Michigan bird species use wetlands for breeding or migrating, and that includes 19 species listed as threatened or endangered in Michigan. I've listed some wetland birds of southern Michigan on the right here. This is a DNR publication. But remember again that when we think about wetlands, we're not just thinking about wetland birds per se, but the many, many species of birds that might use wetlands for habitat for some part of the year, even if they don't breed there, or might use wetlands during their migratory cycles. Well, what kinds of plants grow in wetlands? As I mentioned, wetlands require special adaptations, and I don't know why it is, but it seems that many of the wetland species are really quite lovely, including some of our orchid species. But just to look at the numbers, of the 2,228 native plant species that occur in Michigan, and looking also at the subset of the 361 rare plants, that is the ones that are endangered, threatened, or of special concern, 34% of those are either obligate wetland species or facultative wetland species. That is, they occur 67% or more of the time in wetlands. That's where they're found. So fully a third of our species are wetland species, and yet wetlands occupy only less than 15% of Michigan's land area at this point. So that sort of tells you that it's really particularly important to preserve these wetlands to help this whole big set of species. And let's just look at a few of the species we're talking about. As I mentioned, wetlands host a bunch of orchid species. So many of our Michigan orchids, including all of those on the top row, the fringed orchid, the Arethusa orchid, and the showy white lady slipper, are found in wetlands, and primarily in wetlands. Also, the middle species on the lower row is the small yellow lady slipper. All of these are species that I've seen in Michigan wetlands. Then there are just a bunch of other interesting and showy wetland species, including the fringe gentian on the lower left, and marsh marigolds, which grace our woodland wetlands in the spring on the lower right. So if you enjoy looking at wildflowers, wetlands are a wonderful, wonderful place to do that. And if you happen to have a wetland on your property, you might be rewarded with some very interesting sights. So how do you recognize if you have wetlands on your land? Well, I've talked about the key characteristics of hydrology, soils, and plants. But if you really want to just go through a little mental checklist, here are some things that you could ask yourself. Is the ground soggy underfoot in the spring? Are there depressions where the water pools? Are there areas that you avoid with vehicles for fear of getting stuck? Would you need a drainage ditch to dry it out, or are you tempted to put a drain in there? Is it a depression where the plants really look different from the surrounding area? Or maybe if it's in a woodland, maybe it's just totally bare of plants. Do you see groundwater seeping or a spring at the surface, like even days after a rain? Do you see wetlands seeping out, or sorry, water seeping out? And then you might think about checking a local map. Topological maps often have wetland areas indicated. There are National Wetland Inventory maps or this National Resource Conservation Service soil survey maps. All of those can be places to look and see whether there are any indications out there that wetlands might occur on your land. I would also strongly encourage you to hire an expert to identify and delineate wetlands before doing any construction, including seemingly harmless things like boardwalks, but especially things like draining or filling, if you have any areas that you think could be a wetland. Just as a broad brush stroke, where do wetlands occur in Michigan? This is a kind of dated map, but it was the most recent I could find from the Fish and Wildlife Service from 1990s data. But the areas that are marked in green are predominantly wetlands. So you can see wetlands are concentrated at the current time in the UP and in northern Michigan. We had likely many more wetlands. Well, actually, we know we had many more wetlands in southern Michigan, but at this point, many of those have been drained, channeled, and destroyed. Southern Michigan has probably lost about 75% of the wetlands that it used to have. So let's think again about where wetlands occur and what some different wetland types are. So wetlands, broadly speaking, are classified by kind of where they occur and then what kind of vegetation they have. So marshes can be tidal or non-tidal, and often occur on ocean, lake, or river edges. But the key to a marsh is that it's frequently inundated and it has soft-stemmed or herbaceous plants. That is, it's not going to have trees and shrubs growing there. A swamp, we have many negative connotations with the term swamp, but really all a swamp is a wetland that has woody plants. It has trees, it's a forested wetland or a shrub wetland, so it has trees or shrubs. And finally, there are bogs or fens, which are both different kinds of peatlands. Bogs tend to be acidic. They don't have any water source running into them, feeding them. And so that makes their chemistry more acidic, whereas fens can form peat, but they are fed by groundwater, which then changes the water chemistry and makes them either circumneutral or more alkaline, and that affects the plant communities that grow there. But they're two different types on a continuum of peatland wetlands. Michigan has a range of natural communities, and if you are an ecologist, you like to divide things and classify things. I meant to show an image. This is drawn from a book put out by Michigan Natural Features Inventory called A Field Guide to Michigan's Natural Communities. And you can also access much of this information on the Michigan Natural Features Inventory website. So I just wanted to point out here that I've talked about the broad terms of marsh and swamp, which is the shrub wetland and the forested wetland group, and then fens or bogs. If you're an ecologist, you've divided that into many different types, depending on the particular soil characteristics, where in the state it occurs, what kinds of plants occur there. Those numbers in parentheses are the number of different types of marshes, for instance, or wet prairies that occur in Michigan according to this classification. So I'm not even going to try to give you all of the different types for Michigan. I'm just going to show examples of each type in general. So marshes, again, are frequently inundated and characterized by herbaceous plants. Wet prairies are similar to marshes, but not tidal, and often have saturated soil, but not necessarily standing water. So they can even occur in the western part of the state on some quite sandy soils. And like marshes, they have herbaceous plants. You can see some trees in the distance, but they're characterized by herbaceous plants, but not necessarily standing water. We have a fen here. Fens are fed by groundwater. Again, not always standing water on the surface, although typically in the spring they might have that. And there can be different zones in a fen where you might have a wetter edge and then a drier area. Fens in general are sloping, even if it's not very perceptible, because they're fed by groundwater, which is very slowly moving downhill. And they often have some quite spectacular plants. I was just in the fen yesterday. That was really stunning, both in the summer and in the fall. The bog shown here on the left, again, bogs often have a zone where you might have open water, you might have a ring of trees, and then sometimes shrubs. You often have an upland adjacent, and then an area where you have the sphagnum moss that turns into peat. And then finally, you have, forested wetlands. Oops, let me go back here. You have some forested wetlands on the lower left, which can include forest floodplains, forested swamps, and then some vernal pools. And I want to just look at a couple of those because they might sometimes be a bit harder to recognize. Floodplain forests occur typically next to large rivers. And you see in the photo here that they're standing water, but throughout much of the summer, there might not be any water at all. And often that ground will be quite bare. So you might not think of it as a wetland. But the typical trees that will clue you in that this could be a wetland are cottonwood trees, shown here, sycamore trees, and silver maples. All of those have adaptations to being near seasonally changing but running water. So running water sources, but areas that can get also quite dry. I wanted to point out floodplain forests because it is a community type that has been quite threatened, or quite reduced, I should say, by shoreline development. And in Washtenaw County, back when Washtenaw County had a planning commission, this was one of two community types, along with oak savannas, that was rated as particularly fragile because of all the threats of development. A second wetland type that's not even technically a wetland is the vernal pool, which is a seasonal pond that occurs usually in a forested setting. There's a whole vernal pool partnership that aims to identify and protect these areas. Some people have referred to vernal pools as wicked big puddles that occur in the spring, or even as the coral reefs of the northeastern forests, because they contain a suite of interesting and unusual species such as fairy shrimp, and because they're such important sources for many of our herps, breeding grounds for frogs and salamanders. And those of you who have vernal pools are probably treated to quite a lot of frog song in the spring, the deafening roar of peepers, and maybe some wood frogs as well. So I just wanted to point out vernal pools in specific as a really cool wetland resource that you might have. If you don't see it flooded, though, it might be hard to notice it. So you might look in your forest for areas that have bare ground. Often vernal pools, when they dry out, are quite bare if they don't have characteristic wetland plants that occur there. Or you might see buttress trees, these broad spreading bases, surface roots that spread out are quite bare. All of those are indicators, if you see them in a forest, that this is a seasonally wet area, very likely a vernal pool. And that indicates that you could have a nice wetland. Now, these are often so small that they don't appear on wetland maps. And they typically fall in such a small range, and they're isolated from water bodies often. So they don't necessarily have legal protections under our current regulatory framework. And yet they are very, very important wetlands. And if you happen to have one, a great wetland to work to protect. As I mentioned, there are a number of threats to wetlands, and the biggest is probably that they have been drained, tiled or ditched and channeled for agricultural and residential use. Now, we have a history of that for over a century in the state, and I'll get a little to some of our statistics in a little bit, but just noting that these many of our wetlands have already been destroyed or damaged through tiling, ditching, and channeling. Water pollution is a big source, both chemical toxins, acid rain, but also things like nutrient overload from fertilizer that runs off adjacent areas. Invasive species, there are a number of plants that are quite invasive in wetlands and can pose a threat to both the native species, but can also, as I mentioned, over time actually change the characteristics and the hydrology of a wetland. And finally, we don't know exactly how climate change will affect individual local areas, but we do know that patterns of precipitation are changing, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So thinking about wetland loss, originally wetlands are thought to have occupied about 1/3 of the state of Michigan, and those have been reduced now to under 15% of our land area. So more than 50% of Michigan's wetlands have been lost to human activity, including agriculture, draining, and development. As I mentioned early on, in some of our southern counties, that figure is 75% or more of our wetlands have been lost. Throughout southern Michigan, there is a lot of agricultural tiling. The image on the left shows the current way of doing agricultural tiling. It's actually not a tile per se, it's a PVC pipe that's perforated, and is placed in a soil using a ditch digger, and then that's used to collect the water and drain it off into a drain like the one shown on the right, which then conveys that water off the land so that it's more suitable for agriculture or perhaps for building. Our remaining wetlands, though, are affected by pollution, by some drainage and sediment issues and so on. So what wetlands we do have still have other challenges facing them. But getting back to the draining and tiling issue, I just wanted to point out, so this again is the county drain map for Washtenaw County. Washtenaw County now calls it the Washtenaw County Water Resources Commission, but many counties in Washtenaw until recently had a drain commission. And the reason it's called a drain commission is because many streams were straightened, channelized, they were often dredged. And the whole point, as you can see in this blow up from the southeastern part of the county, is all of these streams were channeled, or new channels were dug to drain the land to make it better for agriculture. So anytime on a drain map you see these very straight lines, that's a channel that was either a stream that has been straightened, which means most of the adjacent wetlands were lost, or it's a new channel that has been dug to drain a wetland area. And so these maps give you a hint of the ways in which we've altered the wetland regimes. I mentioned climate change. We know that there have been changes in the amount of precipitation, and that the change in seasonality also poses new challenges. For example, we are getting more precipitation as rain rather than snow, particularly in northern Michigan. Snowpack tends to hold water for a while, and then snowmelt gradually releases it in the spring, whereas water that comes as precipitation that comes as rain in the winter just runs off the land faster, especially if there are freezing conditions and the land can't absorb that water. And plus, during the winter, there aren't plants growing that absorb the water. So winter rain tends to lead to more flooding conditions during the winter, but also that means that springs can be drier because there isn't that source of gradual snow melt to be giving water to the plants if they're emerging in the spring. But alternatively, we can have very heavy rain events because warm air holds more moisture. And so the plants can dry out faster because that hot air or warm air is sucking the water out. And then we might have these very heavy rainfall events that dump more water on the land than the plants and the wetlands can absorb. So we're seeing both increased drought and increased flooding. And these challenges will continue to evolve as climate changes, and local areas are not fully understood how that will play out in all of our different local areas within Michigan, but we do know that the changes are coming. I mentioned some wetland invasive species, just to list a few of those. Those of you who have done some stewardship are probably familiar with species like Phragmites. You know that we have a native cattail species in Michigan, but also a non-native species, and occasionally those hybridize. Non-native are typically the ones that you'll just see a dense stand of cattails. But both native and non-native cattails tend to thrive in the nutrient-rich conditions when you have agricultural runoff with a lot of nitrogen or phosphorus fertilizers. And so even a very dense native stand of cattails can indicate a a nutrient enrichment problem, but more typically native cattails will be mixed with a range of other species. And so if you see a dense stand of cattails, it's often that non-native. Other invasives are things like reed canary grass and purple loosestrife. Purple loosestrife has been the subject of a biological control, a beetle that was bred up and released in the 90s and seemed to be controlling purple loosestrife very well. But I have to say this year I'm seeing more purple loosestrife than I have in a long time. So I don't know whether that means that those beetle populations are wearing out or whether they're just at a low point and need to increase again. Some others, a woody plant that's in wetlands is glossy buckthorn. Some newer ones are flowering bulrush and Eurasian milfoil. And then Japanese knotweed, Japanese stiltgrass, Asian bittersweet, multifloria rose are not technically wetland plants, but all of them tend to like and tolerate wetland edge conditions. So often moist forests or river floodplains are places where you might find these. So just to show you some pictures of those plants that I mentioned, starting from the upper left, a dense stand of Phragmites. That's what Phragmites tends to do. If it invades a wetland, it just grows in a very dense stand, spreading by not just seeds, but by above ground stolons, they're called, horizontal stems, as well as below ground rhizomes. The middle shot is the non-native cattail. To the right here, we have reed canary grass, often found in agricultural and disturbed wetland soils. Here's purple loosestrife, very lovely flower, and still sold, in fact, in some garden stores, but really bad news for our wetland natives. And not actually very closely related at all to our native plants called loosestrife. Flowering bulrush shown on the bottom here is a newer threat. It's again still sold by some garden stores because it's really quite an attractive flower, but really filling up some parts of the Huron River watershed. Here you have Eurasian milfoil. Those of you who live on lakes might be familiar with this, or rivers with shallow areas. We do have some native species of milfoil that are really quite lovely. This one is just much beefier, denser, more robust. And likely if you see an area that's just totally clogged with milfoil, it's probably the invasive. And then on the lower left, there is our glossy buckthorn, which can form quite dense stands in areas that might otherwise host our native shrubs. Typically in a shrub wetland, we might have willows and dogwoods, a series of our native species. And this can overtake those wetlands, as well as grow into wetlands that would otherwise be herbaceous wetlands. So I want to move now to thinking about how to manage your wetlands. If you have wetlands on your property, what should you do to manage them? Well, the very first thing is to do no harm, thinking about that medical adage. Wetlands are protected by a range of state and federal laws. Federal laws protect any wetlands that are 5 or more acres in size, and then there are some state and local laws that might protect wetlands as small as 2 acres. But those are only general guidelines because there are additional protections for wetlands that occur near or adjacent to water bodies, such as streams and rivers, and anything on the Great Lakes adjacent also has additional protections, and those protections vary by the distance from the water body or from the Great Lakes. And those are in place even for considerably smaller wetlands. So be very careful before you do anything that could damage a wetland. And that includes especially any kind of construction, digging, draining, tiling, or dam removal. Agricultural activities and vegetation removal, such as logging or mowing, are exempted from these laws. But keep in mind that if you actually want to protect your wetland and your wetland species, that both of those activities can be very damaging. So again, I would strongly encourage you, if you're thinking about any activities in your wetland or near your what you think is a wetland, to get a wetland professional to help you identify and map your wetland. There is something called the Michigan Wetland Association that has some list of wetland professionals, and I believe the state websites also maintain some lists of professionals who do wetland delineations. Maybe you know that you have a wetland and what you'd really like to do is restore it so that it has more of the native species that might have characterized it in the past. One way to start with any kind of restoration project, whether wetland or upland, is just to be passive. Simply stop any disturbance in the area and let the wetland recover. Maybe you have grazing animals that are in a wetland and you just want to move the fence so that you keep them out of the wetland area and restrict access. You know, if there's been ORV use, keep those out of the wetlands. Any kind of disturbance to the soil and vegetation, just stop it and wait and see what happens. Sometimes if you just leave things alone, the seeds are already there and you'll start to see plants recover. But other times you have a wetland that's more affected by human activity and you just have to take more active measures in order to restore it. And that might include things like, if you know an area has been tiled and drained for agriculture, often low spots in old agricultural fields, there will be tiles and drains, or maybe there have been dams put in place to affect water flow. Any kind of active measures like removing tiles, drains, and dams, you should consult a professional to offer guidance on those legal requirements again, and to help you understand where exactly the wetland is and what the implications of those activities are. You might also think about helping out natural plant succession by adding in some native wetland plants. You can do that by seed, or you can get plugs, that is small plants, and transplant them in. Both of those can be a big help to restoring areas that are devoid of native plants. You might need to control the invasives first. And again, if you have questions about how to do this, I would say seek out guidance from your local Nature Conservancy, the Stewardship Network chapter, or professionals that you might consult. And there are many, many resources on the web as well. EGLE has a lot of web resources showing you where you can get information on how to do wetland restoration. So I'd encourage you to do some searching before you do this. I will say from personal experience that seeding in a wetland can be challenging. It's hard to necessarily seed in the right times, or to get the seeds to grow without having many species of small mammals or birds eat those seeds first. So planting plants is a quicker way if you really want to get some gratification sooner rather than later. But also keep in mind that when you transplant plants in a wetland, you might have to protect them from deer, from small mammals, from other things that also might want to eat them. So lots of interesting challenges if you decide to actively restore your wetlands. And again, I encourage you to consult professionals. So as I just mentioned, there are a lot of programs and possibilities to think about protecting your wetlands. I would strongly encourage you to check out the series of Stewardship Network talks that has preceded this one, as well as a lot of resources offered by EGLE. I'm just going to briefly touch on two ways in which your wetland protection efforts could actually gain you some income. One of those is called mitigation banking. And that is, if you have an intact wetland, you can agree to protect that wetland and make that part of the state of Michigan's wetland mitigation bank, which means that when there's a developer in another area who wants to destroy a wetland, they have to make sure that there's an equivalent or greater amount of wetland that's protected elsewhere in the state, and preferably closer rather than farther. And that's what the mitigation bank is that Michigan runs. And you can actually be paid for entering your wetland into that mitigation bank. It's a complicated process. And again, other talks have covered this in detail, so I'm not going to give you a lot of details here. But if you have any questions or think that that might be a possibility for you, I'd encourage you to go directly to the EGLE website to find out more about it, and then contact the EGLE folks in charge of the mitigation banking. Another potential source of income for protecting or restoring wetlands is under the USDA Wetland Reserve Program. Now, up until about 10 years ago, many acres of wetlands were set aside through this program, and farmers could get income from leaving that ground fallow or actively planting wetland species on lands that were wetlands. Those programs, however, are constantly changing and evolving. The Farm Bill changes every 5 years. I believe the Wetland Reserve Program has been folded into some other programs, and the funding has changed. So I would strongly encourage you, if you are in an agricultural area and think that you might have some wetlands, that you should contact your local Natural Resource Conservation Service office or your conservation district for details about how these programs work. Again, possible source of income, but some complexities and particularities about how you apply for it. So make sure to go and find the latest sources of information about how that could work for you. So I want to move on now just to offer a couple more slides to remind you about all the reasons to protect your wetlands. There are some really cool and wonderful wild wetland plants. Bogs in particular have just the most amazing plants. And the plant shown here is a little sundew growing in a bog in northern Michigan. Sundews are actually carnivorous plants. So all those little droplets that you see have enzymes that when they trap insects, they can digest the insect and supply nutrients to the plant. So super cool adaptations. And of course, many of you know pitcher plants, which have in the pitcher this little pond that collects rainwater, but also has enzymes that, again, trap insects and decompose them and absorb those nutrients. But while you may know the pitcher plant, how many of you have seen the pitcher plant flower? It is just like the coolest flower, like a Dr. Seuss creation. If you go out into a bogland right now, you will see these turning a bright red. And I had that picture, but I forgot to put it here, of the gorgeous bright red that these flowers turn. So some real treats await you if you explore a bog. Some other awesome wetland plants that we have, gentians, the bottled gentian on the upper left, another wetland plant, a number of different pickerel weed plants, some particular ferns. This is ostrich fern unfurling in the spring in a wetland with some skunk cabbage in back. I mentioned that skunk cabbage can be an indicator of a swamp forest or a groundwater seep. And some of these particular ferns are indicators as well. Ostrich fern, cinnamon fern, and royal fern are all wetland ferns. Our native irises, both the yellow flag and the blue flag iris, are wetland natives. I'm not even going to get into the whole issue of sedges, but Michigan has hundreds of sedge species, and many of them are wetland species, including this cool one, which I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, is gray sedge that has these mace-like seed heads and is a wetland native. Those of you who have deeper water wetlands have probably been treated to some of the emergent or floating plants like water lilies and spatterdock that are blooming. And if you live near a fen, you get just one of these really cool trees, the tamarack, the only deciduous conifer that we have occurring in Michigan. Now, the tamarack was attacked by an invasive larch sawfly about 20 years ago, and there was a widespread tamarack die-off, but they seem to be coming back, and I'm seeing lots of tamaracks in our wetlands doing really well this year. Just a few resources that I wanted to point out. There is a book called Living with Michigan's Wetlands, a Landowner's Guide, that was put out in 1996 and reprinted in 97 and 98. That was done by what was then known as the Department of Environmental Quality. That was done in partnership with the Tip of the Mitten Watershed Council. And I believe they have a more recent version of this that they've continued to publish with updates that you can find if you search for it online. Michigan Natural Features Inventory is a wonderful source for finding out about all those different wetland communities and also the rare species that occur in wetlands. And those are searchable by county. So I'd strongly encourage you to explore that website for some ideas about what you might have on your property. Michigan Flora Online is the source of a number of the photos that I've used in this presentation that weren't my own photos. But if you want to learn about plants on your wetland, that is the place to go. It is somewhat technical, but it's also a great compendium of photos. So if you just want to look at some good wetland plant photos, a great place to look. And finally, I just wanted to flag the vernal pools partnership. Again, vernal pools need special protection, and that's a place to join in the effort. And I should mention the Michigan Herp Atlas. I realized I forgot to put it here, but the Michigan Herp Atlas and Dave Mifsid's work on herp habitats is really key for thinking about how you can make sure to manage your wetland to protect frogs, turtles, salamanders, toads, and lizards and snakes. A few more resources. I have these as links, and so I will make this available as a PDF if anybody wants to follow these. Just again, thanks to Michigan Flora for all those great photos, to Michigan Natural Features for their work on rare species and natural communities, to that vernal pool partnership and Dave Mifsid. And thank you to the Stewardship Network and EGLE for hosting this series and giving me this opportunity. Once again, just want to say, if you don't remember anything else from this presentation, I hope you remember how to recognize poison sumac. For those of you who have signed up for it, I will be exploring some Michigan wetlands in the field this Saturday at Waterloo Rec Area. If you signed up on the list, and it was limited because it's hard to have too many people on a field trip, but if you are signed up, I will be giving you an email with the details of where we'll meet and what you should be prepared for. So be on the lookout from an email from me. And with that, I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. So Rob, if there are any questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Jacqueline. That was a wonderful presentation. So I'll start with a question from Bill, and it was earlier on in the presentation. He asked, you mentioned that construction of a boardwalk necessitates wetland delineation. Some wetland regulations focus on adding/removing soil and exempt installation of piers. Can you say more about this?
I am really not the best person to give the details of wetland regulations. I just know that if you have particular questions, you should consult either EGLE or someone who works in wetland delineation. I'm an ecologist rather than a wetland specific professional, so I don't want to give you incorrect information. I just do want to make people aware that even things like putting in place boardwalks can trigger some of those regulations. So you just should find sources, reliable sources for more information on that. Sorry to punt, but I don't want to give you wrong information.
That is totally fine. Thank you. And then Barbara asks, and I think that you mentioned a couple ways to do this, but she says, where do you find a wetland expert?
So there is something called the Michigan Wetland Association that I should have linked that as well. I'm sorry I didn't, but they maintain some lists of wetland professionals. And I believe I know I have encountered on EGLE's website some lists of wetland professionals as well. You might have to search in different ways. Another possibility is to consult your local conservation district. They will often maintain lists of people who deal with wetland delineation, as well as forest stewardship planning, because some forests are wetland forests, and there are also those vernal pools. And so sometimes forest stewardship planners that work under either the agriculture programs or the forest programs might also be a source of people to help you understand your wetlands.
That's great. Thank you. And I put the Michigan Wetlands Association URL in the chat for anyone that is interested.
Thank you so much, Rob.
Yep. And then, so we have a clarification or a question from Janice about yellow flag iris mentioning that it is not native to Michigan. Is that true? I think I missed that part.
We could double check that. I am pretty sure that there is a species of yellow flag that is native. I would have to double check, and my source always is Michigan Flora Online. So I would say do that quick check. I will follow up on that afterwards, and Rob, I can provide that information to you.
That's great. I also found a link from Habitat Matters about several different species that look very similar. And thank you, Janice, for sharing the Michigan Flora link as well. And it's looking like originally from Europe, but again, there may be several different species of it. So we will clarify with that, and definitely good to do research to make sure that we're talking about the correct plants. So I want to open it up for anybody else that has any questions. I'm not seeing any in the Q&A, and I haven't seen any new ones in the chat from what I can tell. So please feel free to enter your questions into the chat. And then I guess, Jacqueline, I would just ask briefly, and you kind of said that you are coming from more of the ecologist end and less of like the regulatory kind of professional, but just curious about any experiences or kind of success stories you might have about people that have either gone for those, financial incentives for their wetlands, or, successfully protected wetlands in their community. Is there anything specific you've heard kind of from like a landowner driven perspective, somebody who was interested in protecting land on their property or in their community?
So I do know of people who have had wetlands on their property and have explored the wetland mitigation banking, and were pleasantly surprised to find that they could gain some income from protecting their land. I will say that has some caveats. One is obviously you have to protect the wetland, but there are some people who are a little bit concerned about this whole idea that we can just trade off protecting one wetland for destroying another. So I've also known people who've not wanted to engage in the wetland mitigation banking because they just feel like wetlands should be protected, period. And they don't want to offer their wetland in trade for some wetland being destroyed elsewhere. So I would just say, if you want to explore that and you're really committed to protecting your wetland, but really need the income and really need the financial help, it's a good option. Just be aware that there are trade-offs.
That's helpful. Thank you. Yeah, I can imagine how that would be complicated to choose whether or not to do that. And then thank you, David, for sharing your contact info in the chat. Department of Forestry, working as a forest stewardship plan writer, and all of his contact info is in there for anyone that's interested. And with that, unless there are, oh, here, I see another question, one moment. So Susan asks, I have a question about the funding. Is it possible for smaller landowners to get support? Anything I've looked into is for larger land parcels. I have 3 acres of former agricultural land in southeast Washtenaw County, nice vernal pools.
That's a really good question and a challenge. In general, the programs such as the Wetland Reserve and Mitigation Banking are for larger areas. So if you just have 3 acres, it can be hard to find funding. That said, however, I would encourage you to talk to local organizations such as the Nature Conservancy. If you're anywhere close to one of their properties, check with the Stewardship Network in your area, check with watershed councils, because there are sometimes other small pots of money that might be available for activities for smaller landowners. Even just, on the other, just thinking outside the box, things like Wildflower Association of Michigan has grants for planting wildflowers. So if you think your vernal pool needs some restoration and you want to plant some native things there that you think ought to be there but aren't, you might be able to get a small amount of funding there. So you're right, it's a challenge when you are talking about a small area or a backyard area. But I would encourage you to just look at local conservation organizations that might have an interest and might be able to help you think about other funding sources.
Susan says, great tips. Thank you. All right. And with that, if we don't have any other questions, I just wanted to say again, thank you, Jacqueline, so much for the presentation. It was wonderful, very informative. I am not a wetlands expert, and so this series has been very insightful for me, if nothing else, but I also I've heard a lot of great feedback from folks that have joined us. And once again, please visit our website at stewardshipnetwork.org/EGLE, EGLE, to find the other opportunities to get involved in this series. And if you have any questions related to the recording or anything else, you can reach out to me at rob@stewardshipnetwork.org, and we will provide this recording and also the slides that Jacqueline mentioned shortly. So thank you all so much. And Jacqueline, once again, thank you for being a part of it.
Well, thank you, Rob, and thanks to all of you for joining, and hope you enjoy your wetlands.